We keep people around until they're useful, the CEO said, like it was a compliment. Loyalty's cute until it costs us money. 2 knocks. 1 manila folder. 21 years of unpaid nights, duct tape fixes, and quiet problem solving folded into a single packet that smelled faintly of printer ink and inevitability. I set it on the kitchen counter between my coffee can and the house keys. And for the first time in decades, the weight in my hands felt like leverage, not burden. They'd built their empire on the assumption I would always be invisible. The person who knew every fuse, every backdoor, every forgotten lease clause. They'd been wrong. The folder was small. The consequences were not. My name is Mara Ellison. For 21 years, I was the person the company called when the lights flickered, the printers jammed, or the server panels ran hot on a summer afternoon. I knew every pipe, every fuse, and more importantly, I knew the contract language nobody else read because it was boring legal stuff. I loved the work, the problem solving, the small victories, the hum of fluorescent lights when everything ran true. I also learned how the world rewards faces better at cocktail parties than at circuit breakers. When new leadership arrived 8 months before the folder found its way to my kitchen, the dynamics started to change. Titles were swapped like trading cards. A few people were promoted for reasons unconnected to merit. There was the expected gawking at the new executive suite. Bigger chairs, finer pens, a coffee machine that spat espresso like a machine that remembered it was important. They smiled at each other across conference rooms and called it strategic realignment. 2 months later, the company asked me to hand in my keys. They did not say it in those words. They said it with the practiced gentleness of HR, a calendar invite labeled one-on-one, and a manila envelope with a standard issue severance offer. It was not dramatic. It never is. The receptionist's face registered the moment. That small catch between sympathy and the professional distance that keeps people from being honest at someone else's expense. I took my box of desk plants and my chipped mug and left like someone walking through fog. People whispered in hallways with the guilty laughter of those who'd just seen a whole life reduced to a shipping box. On the way home, I went to the hardware store and bought a leather portfolio. I had long ago learned to keep things. Copies of old amendments, receipts, the quiet evidence of a career. I had a file I always jokingly called, for when they forget who did the work. The portfolio fit into the crook of my elbow like a promise. At night, after the moving truck left and the office lights dimmed for me, but not for the people who had hired cleaners to polish the evidence of my absence, I opened the file. What I found in those manila folders was the history of the place I had built with janitorial overtime, late-night patching, and meticulous management. It was not glamorous. Invoices, email exchanges about ductwork, the early lease agreement. But among those papers were the small legal levers I had kept because I had the temperament to read a clause and the foresight to save it. On page 5 of a dusty amendment signed 2 decades ago, there was a clause no one else had flagged in a spreadsheet of strategic priorities. The original commercial lease was in my name as the named tenant for certain ancillary spaces, not the corporation. A drafting oversight, possibly, from a time when the founder had handed me the responsibility of dealing with the landlord on the fly. At the time, it had felt practical. We needed someone to sign, and he trusted me. He probably thought it was temporary. 21 years later, it still existed, and, crucially, the corporation had been operating those spaces through a series of licensing agreements that were administratively convenient but legally fragile if the named tenant decided otherwise. I read the clause again. Renewal required 30 days as written notice by the tenant of record to the landlord. There were notes in the margin in my handwriting, dates of phone calls, the name of the property manager who always demanded the same brand of limes for the lobby water. They had never asked me to remove my name. They had never thought to. For decades, I had been invisible and important in equal measure. There are stories about revenge that rely on cruelty. This is not one of them. I had no interest in petty humiliation. I wanted one thing and one thing only: fairness that included accountability and the chance to keep living my life with dignity. I had been the first person to arrive at the office when the roof leaked in a storm. I had been the one to negotiate the satellite backup when the fiber went down for 2 hours during a major product launch. When the company needed continuity, they called me. When the company wanted to show off its margins to investors, they took credit for a system I'd kept afloat. And when it came time for strategic changes, I learned what it feels like to be quietly set aside. So I did what people who have spent decades in the weeds do. I prepared. I called an attorney I'd used once to register a trademark for a side project years ago. Her name was Evelyn Park, and she had the soft confidence of someone who had spent her life making complicated things simple. We did not operate in secrecy. We operated in method. Over the next 10 days, I made discreet, lawful moves. Copies certified. Certified letters drafted. Calls that left flurries of voicemail like breadcrumb paths. I did everything in daylight and with counsel. I am not going to pretend the choice was comfortable. It wasn't. There was a moment the night before the first certified letter went out when I sat at the kitchen table and thought about how this would look if it were painted as spite. I thought about the polite smiles of former colleagues and the humiliation they'd felt when they heard news they could not control. I thought about the small child I would meet at a friend's picnic who would ask me why strangers on the internet were angry at me. I thought about the ways families explain things to each other and how messy the explanations can become. But I could not let the fear of how people would see me keep me from doing the thing that was right for me and, in some sense, right for the company that had depended on such a fragile architecture. The first certified letter went to the property manager with a tone of formal gravity. It was a notice of termination of the tenancy for the annex spaces, 30 days effective. There was no threat. There was only an assertion. The lease had not been renewed by the corporate occupant by the deadline required. The letter attached the original lease, my signature, and a clear, concise explanation. In the morning, I posted a public notice on the door of the building's annex suite. It was tedious, a red-lettered statement placing all parties on formal notice of the pending termination. But it was also ritual. Paperwork transmuting years of quiet labor into a legal fact that would force conversation. When I affixed the laminated notice, my hands of habit, the ones that could always find a hidden screw or a spare fuse, did not tremble. I felt oddly calm, like someone finally who had read the manual. What followed was not cinematic. It began with a flurry of frantic phone calls and escalated into the kind of corporate worry that produces task forces and emergency branding meetings. The CEO, a man who had taken a chummy selfie with venture capitalists earlier that year, called me. His voice was a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "Mara," he said, "I don't understand. This says you terminated the lease. Are we being evicted? You have the legal right to appeal," I said, calmly and plainly. "But I am the tenant of record for that space. The lease is in my name for now." There was a beat of silence, the weight of a man measuring his options and finding them thin. "This can't be happening," he said. "We need that space. I'm willing to negotiate," I replied. "If your intent is to continue operating the space uninterrupted, the terms will need to reflect that this is not just our space. There will be a formal contract, with appropriate compensation for the use of the space and indemnifications in writing." What the board did not realize was that the paper I had placed on the table changed the grammar of their crisis. Previously, they had assumed they could wield HR-managed layoffs and strategic direction if things went sideways. Now they were confronted with a simple legal reality that required straightforward, written arrangements. They could sue, of course. They could claim unfair treatment, but the optics would be catastrophic. A company with a PR plan rendered powerless because it forgot who held its infrastructure. Lawsuits take time. Companies need offices now. The first round of calls was private. Then an emergency board meeting convened, and men in tailored suits began to pace the long conference table like men rehearsing for an argument they did not expect to lose. Investors called. A general counsel read the clause aloud in a voice that tried to sound neutral but could not entirely conceal the strain. There was murmured talk about oversight and administrative failure. People tried to shape the narrative. Perhaps the tenant of record had been mistaken. Perhaps an email had gone astray. Perhaps there was a technology failure. Human beings are good at plausible deniability. Corporations make careers of it. Meanwhile, I went about the procedural business of my claim. I had already lined up a prospective tenant, not a competitor, not a saboteur, but a small nonprofit that ran community training centers and had been looking for stable space for months. They were bright, earnest, and willing to sign a proper commercial lease at market rates. They were also respectful of the history of the building. Their founder, Anna, was the sort of person who could serve coffee and equal parts resolve. When she and her team walked through the space, I could imagine classrooms where young adults learned trade skills instead of a boardroom where people argued about stock options. For me, that felt like moral ballast. I did not want another startup to take over. I wanted something that acknowledged the community we had always served and the labor that had been put into the building. Negotiation is a strange art. There is always someone who wants you to feel small, and someone who wants to make you feel essential. The company offered money to settle and a counterproposal to engage my service as a consultant. The offer was functional, large enough to soften a legal fight and small enough to preserve the narrative that they had done the right thing by keeping things in-house. It was patronizing. It was also tempting, if only because that kind of money could provide for my daughter's tuition and let me sleep without the gnawing hunger of legal bills. I refused politely. The choice was not vindictive. It was strategic. Taking a consultant's fee would have put me back under the corporate umbrella, a rebadging of the same arrangement that had allowed them to make me disappear. I wanted to hold accountable the architecture that had allowed them to create dependency without reciprocity. Accepting a check would have dissolved the outrage into quiet comfort, a comfort I had been denied for too long. So the board did what boards do when presented with an inconvenient leverage they cannot legally neutralize in a weekend. They mobilized optics. PR statements were drafted. The company announced a strategic pivot and a commitment to people first, while quietly pursuing an arbitration filing. I watched my inbox swell. There were notes from old colleagues, texts that mixed solidarity with a delicate distance. I heard from Miguel, the old foreman who had shown me the ropes when I had been a bright-eyed junior technician, and who would later become the person who taught me to read a clause like you read a map. "Don't burn bridges," he wrote simply. "But do not let them keep burning you." His words were my compass. The eviction, when it happened, was anticlimactic and devastating in equal measure. It is always more confusing to watch people you know, people you have seen making copies at midnight, arguing over paper clips, and celebrating mini wins, scrambling to remove their things than it is to hear a judge deliver a sentence. The movers were efficient. Their faces did not betray the small sorrow of losing a place you'd come to treat like a second home. Some employees wept quietly. The CEO's tie was askew. A PR manager tried to position the narrative, but cameras prefer spectacle to nuance. Bloom, a neutral, solid name for an organization that smelled faintly of eucalyptus after their move-in, had signed a lease and wired the first 2 months' rent. The company's lawyers could threaten, litigate, and scream into the void for months, but they could not make the new tenant leave without a legal fight that would look terrible in the press and worse to investors. The board balked in public while feverishly trying to make deals that would obscure the fact that they had failed to do paperwork that could have saved them months of upheaval. I did not dance on their misfortune. I sat on my porch and watched the sun make the city sparkle in the way it always had. I drank coffee and read the local paper. People I had known for years sent me messages that read like litmus tests. Supportive, hesitant, angry on my behalf, or furious that I had not asked them before I filed the notice. Morality has a long shadow. When you pull a thread, you reveal an entire fabric. There were smaller, private triumphs. Miguel came by with a pie and a list of people willing to testify to the care I had taken with the building. Anna sent a note about a community program they wanted to run with local high schoolers to teach them trades. Priya, who used to run payroll, sent me a text that read, "You were brave in a way I could not be. Thank you." Those moments felt heavy and real. Unlike the frivolous consolation of an HR form letter saying, "We respect your service." But victory, whatever it felt like, was not the same as joy. The aftermath brought with it an unexpected ledger of losses. People who had once shared smoothies at lunchtime drifted away. Some colleagues never forgave me. For them, my action had been a breach of corporate solidarity amounted to betrayal. I understood their perspective in an abstract way. I had used a legal right that had consequences, and their livelihoods were entangled with the result. The human cost of justice is rarely tidy. Worse, the price I paid had a personal dimension I had not fully accounted for. A relationship that had been steady and kind for years, my partnership with Daniel, who loved me for my stubborn commitment to precision and reason, frayed. He had tolerated my late-night calls to attorneys and my spreadsheets that traced receipts like bones on a forensic table. But there is a kind of fatigue that sets in when your partner becomes a public symbol of a fight that reshapes your life. Daniel wanted gentleness. I needed accountability. That divergence was subtle and profound. It did not explode with drama. It unstitched over quiet meals and longer silences. We tried counseling until we realized that sometimes love is not enough to bridge different definitions of risk and sacrifice. We parted with care, not malice, but the absence of his hand in mine at night hollowed out victory in ways I had not predicted. Legally, the company failed. They sued, they appealed, they tried to challenge my standing. The courts, thank goodness, moved with an annoyingly thorough slowness that favored documentation over gut instincts. Arbitration hearings consumed staff hours and made leadership look small when they were forced to read line items in public. Their investors noticed and asked questions that made board members answer with a candor they had not used in private lunches. Over the next year, the company restructured, sold off a few non-core assets, and quietly replaced a few executives. None of that felt celebratory. The company survived, and in surviving, it was smaller in the ways that matter to people who care about culture and dignity. As for me, I started the community training center with Anna and a small, scratch team of instructors who could teach HVAC basics, safe ladder use, basic electrical maintenance, skills that had once relied on silent custodians like me. It was not lucrative, not at first. It was honest. Young adults who had been told by a world indifferent to their uncertainty that they did not have options found apprenticeships that led to steady pay. The first class we taught came full circle when one of the young men we mentored helped his mother fix a leaking pipe and cried quietly after because for the first time he felt capable. Those were the moments where joy threaded through what had started as a legal maneuver. I want to be upfront about the ethics of doing what I did. There is a tempting myth that justice is the easy part. You expose the wrong, you press the button, and the moral scales tip. In reality, justice is procedural. It requires patience, tedious record keeping, and sometimes an appetite for conflict you do not ask for but have to accept. There will be collateral damage. There will be friends who feel betrayed. There will be complicated conversations with people who supported you privately but publicly kept their distance for their own safety. Here are the things I learned during the slow fall and the messy rise. First, documentation is not drama, it's insurance. If you spend your life doing the work people take for granted, keep a paper trail. Not because you want to litigate, but because truth needs a spine of documents to stand on when storms come. Second, method beats moralizing. Anger is useful for starting things, but method finishes them. Bring counsel, stay procedural, and avoid theatrics that make the narrative about you instead of the facts. Third, people will surprise you both ways. Some friends will become champions. Some champions will become nervous critics. Prepare emotionally for the ambivalence. Hold your compass, but let solace come from unlikely places. Fourth, victory is not annihilation. The aim of justice is not revenge in the petty sense. Those whose errors include exploiting or ignoring the unpaid labor of others should be held to account so systems improve. Shrugging off the human cost makes you the kind of leader you did not want to be. And at the last, make room for regret. You will do calculations about what you're willing to lose. These will not always be accurate. Accept the regret that comes and tend it like a wound. It will not disappear, but it will scar into something survivable. There is a quiet Thursday evening now when I walk into the training center and see a room full of people learning something they can take into a job. A student brings in cupcakes they bake to show gratitude. Anna pins up a flyer for our next class. Miguel stops by with a thermos of coffee and a faded screwdriver. He peers at the student boards and nods slowly as if seeing the future take shape in fluorescent light. I feel tired and content in a way I never felt in the glass corporate spaces where applause is measured by a press release. Every time the city lights blink on, I remember the first night I signed that lease with the founder who trusted me enough to hand over a signature. I think about gratitude that can sour into entitlement, about power that forgets craft, and about the small, sturdier things that can hold a life upright. I also think of the people who work through the long nights with me, not the executives with their delicate anxieties, but the technicians who would crawl inside ductwork to get the building back to order. To them, this work felt less like vindication than an overdue acknowledgement. If you find yourself in a place where your worth is assumed and your presence goes unnoticed, take care that your pride does not become your only tool. Pride is a brittle instrument. Prepare, document, and seek counsel. If you are compelled to act, do it with dignity. Avoid the temptation to make the story about spectacle. The light that follows is easier to live under if it's steady and humane. On the day that the community center opened its doors to the first cohort, a local reporter asked me if I regretted how dramatic it had looked from the outside. Had I wanted to hurt the company? Had I wanted to humiliate colleagues? I looked at her and then over her shoulder at a whiteboard where someone had scrawled, in childish handwriting, "Learn to fix things. Learn to be safe." I thought of Daniel's quiet face in the early morning of our last conversation and the way he had left a mug on the counter like a relic of a life we used to share. I wanted something honest, I said finally. I wanted a place where labor was visible and respected. If making that visible required drawing a line that looked ugly for a while, then so be it. I do not celebrate anyone's suffering. I only want systems that do not permit hidden labor to be taken without acknowledgement. He nodded and typed notes like an orderly priest recording a sermon. The headline that followed was catchy, as headlines are. Longtime facilities manager evicts her former employer, a modern parable. Some readers were outraged. Others applauded. The story, like every real story, resisted tidy moralizing. There are nights when I still collect receipts. Old habits die slowly. I keep them for the lawyers of the future, or for the memory of the person who started the company in a place that smelled like fried noodles and late optimism. I walk past the building sometimes, and Anna waves from a classroom window where students are learning to measure and mend. I imagine that the next generation will not have to fight the same small wars over dignity that I did. That hope is enough to get me up in the morning. When someone asks me if my action was revenge, I answer honestly. It was an act of reclamation, I say. It was a way to say, loudly and legally, that our labor matters. It was not meant to crush. It was meant to recalibrate. If I have one last piece of advice, do not wait until the last knock to open your file. Keep your records. Cherish the colleagues who will stand beside you. And when it's time to act, do it in daylight with counsel and courage. Justice is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of how we choose to live afterward.